Are there any players on the roster that the Buffalo Bills could trade away for draft capital? I'm going to break that down and more today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of the Herd Mentality Substack, co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, co-host of the NFL First Read Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, folks, welcome in. It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control our discussion and you send in questions, comments, takes, whatever you have, and I address them here on the podcast. Have some great discussion points today, including trade candidates, Josh Allen and Dalton Kincaid and how they can get on the same page, a fair price for James Cook and a contract, Bobby Babich in year 2, some chatter on Chris Tabor's impact as a new special teams coordinator, lots of stuff to get into today. Let's start with this one from Vin. Vin says, prior to recent years, the Bills never really qualified for any compensatory picks. Brandon Beane would make his own compensatory picks by trading away players for mid to late round picks. With the draft behind us, who are some players that you think could possibly be flipped for a pick? And Vin says, I was thinking Cam Lewis. It's a good question, and I've talked about this before, where the Bills have done a good job, particularly in the past, of building a deep and competitive roster and flipping players for draft picks, whether that was Marshall Newhouse or Russell Bodine or Reggie Ragland, different players along the way that they've been able to send away and get some draft capital back. And so where I think there could be some opportunities this year, and I'll stop short of predicting any of this to happen, but when you consider players that are at a position where the Bills have some level of surplus, but then also might have some level of appeal, right, for a team to trade for, I think you got to have both things to be true for this to be a possibility. These are the names that come to mind for me. I would say Mike White or Mitch Trubisky as depth quarterbacks. I think some teams, could experience an injury in terms of their depth quarterback, and I don't think the Bills will roster both Mike White and Mitch Trubisky, and so could they unload one of them for a late-round pick? I think it's possible. How about Curtis Samuel? I think the Bills are going to roll with Curtis Samuel here, but do they look at the signing of Elijah Moore plus the need for some special teams impact, and they have a draft pick in Caden Prather, and there's Tyrell Shavers, there's Laviska Shenault, there's Jalen Virgil. Want to get one of those guys on the roster and feel like the arrival of Elijah Moore makes Curtis Samuel a player that they could let go of in a trade? Possible. Maybe some offensive linemen. I think the NFL is always looking for offensive line depth. Ryan Vandemark, Kendrick Green are some possibilities there. How about A.J. Epinesa, defensive end? The signing of Joey Bosa, the drafting of Landon Jackson. You still have Javon Solomon, Michael Hoyt, Greg Rousseau. Is that a player that you can unload? Be some nice cap savings to be had if you were able to do that. Maybe Dane Jackson at corner. 2 years ago, he was signed away by the Carolina Panthers with the expectation that he would start for them. Is there some opportunity there based on the Bills drafting, I guess, 2 corners, maybe 3 if you include Jordan Hancock? Signing a Trey White, do they feel like they could trade off Dane Jackson for a late-round pick? How about at safety? You've got DeMar Hamlin, who's got a couple years of starting experience, maybe Derek Forrest. If it doesn't really work out in Buffalo, those are the names that come to mind for me. You mentioned Cam Lewis, and I just don't see that being a player that would be super attractive for the rest of the league. He's small. He doesn't have a ton of athleticism. Now he's competitive and plays above his weight class and has endeared himself in Buffalo and earned the trust in Buffalo, but I don't know that that's a player that would have much appeal in other destinations. So those are the names that make the most sense to me. Although as I said at the beginning, I'll stop short of predicting that any of those players are traded. Starsky has a good question here. Starsky says, I enjoyed the Kincaid talk again recently. Living a couple hours from Kansas City, that playoff drop was devastating. However, I am not as down on him as most fans I talk to. I am heavily invested in him with a jersey and collection of high-end rookie cards, so I am pulling for him more than the average fan. You mentioned several times provided stats and film of Josh being off target with him. I don't think it's because of his rigid mental decisions, and I sure don't think that Josh is missing him on purpose. My question is, why aren't they on the same page? Kincaid seems like the type that puts in the work with Josh. This is a decent sample size. I assume some of it is Josh struggling down the field with all of his receivers last year. I would imagine a good chunk of Dalton's targets were downfield. Could it be that Josh's chemistry is with Knox? Josh drops back and his instincts fall back to Knox's route running out of the tight end position? I'm grasping at straws here, just trying to make sense of the off-target throws. Yeah, I appreciate this question. I think this is a good way to add to this conversation where we've identified a problem, right? The film, the metrics clearly show that the throws that Josh Allen makes to Dalton Kincaid are at a very high rate of being uncatchable. The highest rate of uncatchable targets in the league. And especially poor when they're 10 or more yards down the field. We've identified the problem. So why is there a problem? I've got some thoughts on that. Here's 5 things that come to mind when I consider why Josh Allen and Dalton Kincaid are not on the same page. I would say, first of all, there has been a shift in the types of players that Josh Allen throws the football to. The Bills have been a wide receiver-centric offense, and they've certainly increased the role of the tight end. And I think maybe there's just an adjustment there and throwing to those types of players. You're talking 6'4", 6'5", 240 pounds versus, hey, most of your targets are going to Cole Beasley and Stephon Diggs and Emmanuel Sanders and John Brown. So maybe there's a bit of a shift there and getting on the same page with really different athletic profiles and body types. Number 2, I would say perhaps there's something to the overall turnover that the Bills had at the skill positions. Last year, remember, Khalil Shakir was the only receiver on the team that had played in a game with Josh Allen prior to 2024. And so you're expecting this uptick in volume to Kincaid, and he still received a ton of targets. He was the most targeted tight end in the league on a per route basis. But you're still developing chemistry with a lot of different players, and maybe you take for granted that Kincaid was an established player, but still a young guy that you needed to evolve with. And so I think the overall turnover at the skill positions didn't help. I would also point out that since Kincaid was drafted, there's been 3 different offensive coordinators, right? Or I guess 2, right? Brian Daboll, or he wasn't here with Brett Daboll. It was Ken Dorsey to Joe Brady. And so drafted for Ken Dorsey, right? And then that is now shifted to Joe Brady. And I think there's something to be said there, right? There's an acclimation and adjustment for everyone. I think there's something to Josh Allen being more of a visual player. He's not as anticipatory because he doesn't have to be. And you're talking about Dalton Kincaid and what's he known for? Route running, timing, fluidity. He's more of an on-schedule player, and Josh Allen's more of a visual player. So there's probably some extra layers to developing chemistry with that. And then also Dalton Kincaid's own need to develop. This guy's new to playing football. He was a no-star recruit, didn't start playing football till late in high school, focusing on basketball, and he's still new to the game. And I think there's something to that as well for a position at tight end that's typically pretty slow developing. So those things come to mind as I consider why there has been some chemistry issues between Josh Allen and Dalton Kincaid. All right, coming up next, a great question on James Cook and how to land at a very fair deal for him. I'll explain that and more on the other side of it. Folks, be sure to stick with me. As a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. And LinkedIn's new feature can actually help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip. Add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to get those qualified candidates. It's no wonder that 72% of small businesses say that LinkedIn helps them find high-quality hires. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, I know that many of you are tired of the James Cook conversation, but I think Scott comes at it with a good angle. So let's listen to this question. I'll share some thoughts. Scott says, can you discuss James Cook on herd mentality? Understandably, the front office doesn't want to pay him Barkley, McCaffrey, or Henry tier contract dollars. You've discussed on numerous occasions his snap percentage and his lack of pass protection ability being a liability on passing downs. I agree he does benefit from the play of the offensive line and Josh Allen. Still, it seems like there is a price tag that would make sense for the Bills. If the news broke that he re-signed, what would you want the average annual value to be? Great question. And my tone on this James Cook conversation has never been, don't pay James Cook. I like James Cook. I think he's a good football player. My tone has been, you can't pay James Cook, Derrick Henry, or Saquon Barkley, or Christian McCaffrey money. And I've always said that that $15 million a year number is inappropriate. So let's get to a dollar amount that I think is fair for both sides. And you know how I'm going to look at this? Through percentage of cap at signing. I think it's the most fair way to do it. Right now, the NFL salary cap is $279.2 million. Let me give you some numbers in terms of percentage of cap for certain running backs, right? There's this top tier, this prestigious tier that they play 70, 75% of snaps, high volume pieces of their respective offenses. Christian McCaffrey, his deal is 7.44% of cap at signing. Saquon Barkley, 7.38%. Jonathan Taylor, 6.23%. Derrick Henry, 5.37%. Alvin Kamara, 4.8%. And Josh Jacobs, 4.7%. That's the bucket, right? That's the tier of running backs that I think it's inappropriate for James Cook to be paid in the same range as. But then you get, here's where there's a big tier break. James Conner is at 3.72%. So I think it should be above James Conner, but I think it should be under Josh Jacobs. So Josh Jacobs is at 4.7% of cap at signing. I think James Cook should come in at 4.5% of the cap at signing. What is 4.5% of the $279.2 million cap? Right at about $12.5 million. $12.5 million APY is the dollar amount that I think is fair for the Bills and fair for James Cook. That would be like a 4-year, $50 million deal. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, Joe, if you pay him $12.5 million, why wouldn't you pay him $15 million? You're splitting hairs over $2.5 million. Yeah, I absolutely am, because every dollar matters. Think about it like this. Only 26 players on the Bills currently have a 2025 cap hit of more than $2.5 million. It matters. And you start, if, we're going to split over hairs over $2.5 million here, $2.5 million there. Now you got $5 million. Now you're talking about a starter in terms of cap hit. So, yeah, it matters. And there's precedent. And you got to be real careful about setting precedents. You got to pay people appropriate money. And I think 4.5% of cap at signing makes a lot of sense for James Cook. Next one here comes from Randy. Randy says, what should we expect from Bobby Babich going into his second year as defensive coordinator based on what we saw in his first season? Were there any stylistic themes that differed from what we've seen from McDermott and Frazier in the last several years? The turnover numbers are great. However, I was still underwhelmed by the performance of the defense, but my hope is that it had more to do with the lack of talent on defense mixed with poor execution rather than questionable play calling by Babich. I think there's a number of things to keep in mind for Bobby Babich going into his second season on the job, starting with it not being his rookie year, right? Rookie defensive coordinator. Surely he's learned a lot, right? He went from, this is my first time doing everything. Now I'm leading a staff. I'm leading a defense. I'm the main voice in the room for defensive meetings too. Okay, that's now normal to me. I've done that for a year, and he'll be better positioned to execute, I think. I think not dealing with as much personnel transition. We forget how many players the Bills on defense transitioned away from last year. So not only is it his rookie year, but you've transitioned away from a lot of know-how on your defense. And that's no small undertaking. I think there's better talent this year, particularly with the front, which matters a ton. And remember those challenging early dynamics for Bobby Babich? Matt Milano goes down in preseason. Then in week 1, Taron Johnson goes down in the second quarter. Terrell Bernard goes down early, misses time early in the season. Your whole second level's gone. The Bills are trying to play games against the Ravens with Balen Spector, Dorian Williams, and Cam Lewis as a second level of the defense, right? That's a hard thing to do in your first couple of games as a defensive coordinator in the NFL. Then you have Von Miller's suspension. Your safety competition early on. Don't forget about this. The Bills went into this entire 2024 season with an open battle between Mike Edwards, DeMar Hamlin, and Cole Bishop, and they all get hurt. And so all of that was very difficult from the outset for Bobby Babich in his rookie season. Then you had in-season injuries as well, where if I'm not mistaken, Greg Rousseau and Daquan Jones were the only starters on defense to not miss at least one game due to injury. It was a year of adversity defensively with a new coordinator and a ton of roster transition. So I think all of that should give you a lot of hope for how the defense can be better and ultimately Bobby Babich can be better in year 2. Steve says, could you explore how the coordinator change may alter the team's approach to special teams? What were the issues and how do you see them being addressed this season? I think what it came down to with the Bills special teams under Matthew Smiley is that they lacked consistency in all phases. I don't think there's a single phase that was consistent. Maybe punt return, but everything else was kind of lacking with consistency. And with Coach Tabor coming in, the biggest thing he brings is experience. He's seen issues. He's fixed issues. He knows how to do it, right? He's done this for a long time. And I love that he's coming into this situation after a year out of coaching. Big year for shifting on special teams with the new kick return rule. And now Tabor had the opportunity to observe from a high level. Now he's going to be able to step into an opportunity. And so I think that experience factor is what really matters. I can't sit here and tell you schematically these things will be different, right? I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that this is a guy who's been in these shoes for a long time and has a long history of figuring it out. And I think that's kind of the name of special teams. You figure it out. And I like how Sean McDermott likened the hiring of Chris Tabor as a special teams coordinator to what he did with the O-line coach. The two coordinator hires prior to Tabor on special teams were Matthew Smiley and Heath Farwell. Both were first-time special teams coordinators. And all right, you didn't really work with either one. Now it's time to get experience and know-how in the room. Just like with the offensive line coach, it was Bobby Johnson. I think it was Juan Castillo before him. Both guys really their first time as O-line coaches. Well, okay, enough of that. Here's Aaron Cromer. That's what I see. I see an experience element that I think will matter a ton for the direction of the Bills special teams. Bub says, I think a great part of the schedule, is playing a lot of the quarterbacks of likely AFC playoff teams, offering a chance for the young defensive players to have played those quarterbacks before. Do you agree it's more beneficial than hurtful for this young defense to play 5 top-tier quarterbacks this regular season to prepare them for the playoffs? It's a good question. I do think there's an element of it being beneficial for both sides of the equation, right? The Bills, young defensive players, and the quarterbacks, right? Having a chance to go up against those players. But I do feel like it benefits more the Bills defensive players because it's not going to be their first time seeing them and playing them when it matters most in the postseason. They'll have opportunities facing those guys: Burrow, Mahomes, Hurts, Lamar Jackson, CJ Stroud. The Bills make the playoffs, they're going to face one of those guys, maybe multiple of those guys, right? And I think it will be a benefit to those players that it won't be their first time defending against an offense led by those quarterbacks and understanding the tempo and rhythm and processing and instincts that those guys play with won't be the first time they see it in the postseason. So I think it helps both sides, but I'm thankful and happy, and I think it mostly benefits the Bills' defensive players having that experience under the belt when it gets to the postseason. All right, folks, coming up next, we're talking about possible Taron Johnson replacement, some roster construction ideas, and another one of those questions that digs into my background a little bit. This one, not really a football background, but a musical background. We'll talk about that here on the other side of it, so be sure to stick with me. Welcome back, folks. A quick reminder to you about Bills Squad. New content that is part of the Locked On Bills feed, a twice weekly show with myself, Jerry Ostrowski, and Jeremy White. We do a live stream Mondays and Thursdays at noon Eastern time here on the Locked On Bills YouTube channel. And then once it's done live, it of course lives on YouTube, but then we post it as an audio podcast as well. And that'll be next up Thursday at noon Eastern time, every Monday and Thursday, noon Eastern time. And I'm excited because we're going to have the opportunity to break down the Hard Knocks news. The Bills were announced as this year's team that's going to be featured in Hard Knocks, the training camp Hard Knocks. And we will break that all down, the three of us, on the Thursday stream, noon Eastern time. Hope you guys are enjoying that. The feedback's been really good. We're having a lot of fun, and think it's been great additional content to this podcast feed. All right, let's keep it going. Matt says, Joe, watching Jordan Hancock film, I feel that he will be Taron Johnson's replacement in a couple of years. My reasoning is that being said before the draft that he is going to draft guys with contracts expiring in the next few years. Looking at Taron's contract, I can see that being him. His contract expires after the 2027 season. To start the 2028 season, Taron will be 32 years old. I think they will let him walk and give Hancock a year to prove himself if he hasn't done that beforehand. What are your thoughts? Well, I think this is a maybe. And I talked about this when the Bills drafted Hancock. And I did a conversation about year 1, year 3 roles. And I talked specifically about Taron Johnson's expiring contract and if Jordan Hancock could be a possibility to succeed him. And I think the answer is maybe. I think the reasons why you would say yes to it, based on what we know about Jordan Hancock from studying his tape at Ohio State, is that he's a very good run defender, a guy that can tackle playoff contact. I love his downhill trigger. He's very good at defending the run. And we know that's a big part of what you're asked to do as the nickel corner for the Bills defense. And I think he's very good in zone coverage. I like his feel. I like how he squeezes routes and layers coverage and spaces. He's got a really good feel in zone coverage. So for those reasons, I think to myself, yeah, you know what? I think this could work. I like his size. I like his athleticism. There's a lot of boxes that he can check for that role. Where I have some hesitation is I do think that Hancock needs to evolve in terms of man coverage. I don't think he's a super sticky man coverage guy. I do think his ball skills need some improvement. And there's a uniqueness to the Bills' nickel role that I don't necessarily feel super comfortable slotting anyone there, right? I think it's a very unique position where the way that you have to fit the run, the way that you have to cover, the way that they space the field to kind of funnel a lot of things towards you, it's a lot on your plate. So that overall dynamic gives me some level of a concern about not just Jordan Hancock, but anybody stepping into that role. So I think it's a possibility. And worst case scenario, I think that Jordan Hancock, to really get value out of the pick, I think he could, be a really nice option for the Bills' dime defense where they bring in that 6th defensive back, kind of a hybrid slot safety type position where I think that's really tailored well for the overall skill set of Jordan Hancock. Ian says, I recall a couple of years back when the Chiefs won their most recent Super Bowl, you pointed out that the Chiefs have been very disciplined about how they manage their team salaries, that basically they're 3 guys they view at a critical, they have 3 guys that they view as critical and are willing to give all the money to: Chris Jones, Patrick Mahomes, and Travis Kelce. So with that in mind, who are the core critical guys for the Bills? Josh, but maybe no one else on offense. I think Cook actually has the physical skills, but running back just isn't a place where it's wise to spend deep and commit long. Greg Rousseau on defense, but more by default than being overwhelmed by his production. So who are our core guys, or is it really just Josh? I appreciate you bringing this up, but I do want to clarify. That Chiefs message, and I love that show, and I love the ideas that I shared. That Chiefs message was all about not being afraid to transition because of the certain stability that elements bring to that team. I was talking about how they know who their most important pieces are, that it was Chris Jones and Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. And as long as they took care of that, they were fine with transition around them. And I thought the Bills had a very healthy roster transition entering 2024. So it's not specifically about identifying 3 key players. It's about knowing who is critical and who is not, and then not fearing roster transition when necessary. Kansas City pays plenty of guys that aren't Mahomes, Jones, or Kelce, just like any team should. But they've also been willing to transition away from Tyreek Hill or L'Jarius Sneed or Travarius Ward or Dee Ford or Tyrann Mathieu or Willie Gay or Justin Reed. Like they're never afraid of, okay, well, we think we've done what we need to do with this player, and whether it's contractual issues or where you want to balance out your roster with certain things, they've not been afraid to say goodbye. And I thought the Bills showed similar willingness last offseason with the trading away of Stephon Diggs. And all right, it's time to move on from Mitch Morse and Tre'Davious White and Micah Hyde. Don't have to panic about bringing him back, or Jordan Poyer, whatever, those types of things. I think that's what's important. You have to know when it's time to move on and not be afraid of it, because at your core, you have certain elements that are going to keep you as a contending type team. And so I don't think it's as much about saying, hey, you got to find these 3 guys. I don't think you're going to look at any team in the league and be able to say they have those 3 guys, right? Those are 3 Hall of Famers: Mahomes, Kelce, Allen, right? Or Mahomes, Kelce, Jones. I don't know that a lot of teams are going to be able to say, yeah, we've got that. But it's important to identify who those key pieces are and then not really panic around them. Trust that you can transition. Trust that you have the infrastructure in place because of your core elements. That was the message. It wasn't about, hey, you got to have these 3 guys. Bills WZA has 2 questions. The first one is pass rush win rate by far the hardest term for a football podcaster to say? Yes. And that's why I very carefully said it, so I didn't get twisted up. I would also say that Bruce Nolan's plurality pie is also quite the tongue twister. The other part of Bills WZA's question is this. Since you've been sharing some personal Joe Marino anecdotes the past few weeks, I have one more Joe Marino related question. I recall you mentioning on an episode a while ago that you were in a band. What instrument did you play, and can you tell us more about this? Sure, I'd be glad to. So my dad grew up as a touring musician. He played bass, I think, in a Led Zeppelin cover band. He didn't give us too many details about it other than he lived the rock and roll lifestyle and that he never wanted me or my 2 brothers or my sister to live that type of lifestyle. And my dad became very involved. He still loved to play music. He became very involved in playing bass guitar at our church. And I enjoyed that from my dad. I love seeing him play. I took an interest in that. And so in 3rd grade, I started to play the drums. And then, my dad was a church musician, and I wanted to play music in church as well. And so I played drums for like 3 years, learned how to play them. I was self-taught. And then in 6th grade, I started to get opportunities to play at my church. And so I kind of got like in with that and played drums for a while. And then I wanted to learn how to play the bass. So in 8th grade, I taught myself how to play the bass. Actually, my dad didn't teach me much. He kind of pushed back. He really didn't have that much of like a desire for us to play music. Now, with me and my younger brother, it certainly happened, but it wasn't because he was like prodding us along or coaching us. We really self-taught ourselves. So I started to play the bass like in 8th grade. And then I played mostly drums, but sometimes bass. And then our church needed someone to play acoustic guitar. So I learned how to play that and did that for a little bit. And then I spent like 15 years, maybe longer, being a church musician, mostly playing the bass, some drums, and then occasionally guitar. And it was a big part of what I did from like 6th grade until I was maybe like 33 years old, about 5 years ago. About 5 years ago, I stopped playing in church, and I haven't picked up an instrument since. I do miss it. I hope that I can do it again someday, but my schedule doesn't really give me a whole lot of time for that like it used to. So that's my musical background. It's bass, drums, and acoustic guitar. And I think my best instrument is probably bass, then drums, and then like down a little bit is acoustic guitar. I can basically just strum chords, which will get you through songs. But if you need me to do like fancy picking or bar chords or play the electric guitar lead lines, that's not really going to be for me. But bass and drums, we can do it. We can do that for sure. So that's my my musical background. Appreciate the question on that. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on Locked On Bills. Do appreciate you being here. I kindly ask that you share, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.